Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today, we kind of have two topics in one here, both related to flooding and tackling flood risks with data-driven approaches, and then using exposure mapping and interactive flood visualization. So it's kind of like a two-step process we have going on today. So for any technical help that you need during the webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box and I will do my best to answer those. For your content questions related to the presentation, you can type those in the Q&A box and we will get to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And it would help out too if you have a question for a particular panelist that you state that when you're typing out your question. It just makes it a little easier for me. Up on your screen now is a list of our sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2025. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making this webcast possible and free to members. Today we're sponsored by the Water and Planning Network. And I know that Bill is going to talk a little bit more about them and their affiliation and how they work with divisions. And we are just so glad to have you again for another session this year. So we have one more session left in August, and I am finishing up putting the final details on September, October, and November, believe it or not. So you will have plenty more sessions to register for very soon, and you can head over to ohioplanning.org/planning webcast to register for next week's session, and then eventually all of our upcoming sessions for fall. Today's session is worth 1.5 CM credits if you're looking for those AICP credits, and of course, one of those very valuable sustainability and resilience credits. So log into your My APA account at planning.org, and then you can search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our website, again, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when new sessions are available for you to register for, and a weekly reminder of what's on tap for Friday. We record all of our sessions and we post them onto our YouTube channel. So go to youtube.com/planning webcast. Will pop up along with our well over 500 session recordings, all available to you for free. So be sure to subscribe to our channel so that you get notified when I have uploaded another recording. So one last thing, new this year, we have a mailing list. So if you want to scan the QR code or head over to our website, and at the very top of the website, there'll be an option for you to sign up. I send exactly one email a month at the top of each month, letting you know what sessions are available for you to register for, what's coming down the line, and then any of our on-demand sessions that are available for you to view at your leisure to get your AICP credits. So again, sign up to receive one email a month from me just to keep you updated on our offerings. All right, that's the end of my housekeeping items. Again, if you have questions for our panelists, type them in the Q&A box. We'll get to those at the end during the Q&A. Please don't raise your hand because I won't call on you. Just type those questions in. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to turn it over to Bill to kick things off for us.
Great. Thank you, Christine. I am Bill Sesnick. I'm the co-chair of the Water and Planning Network at the American Planning Association. We're kind of a quasi-division, and we typically associate with energy, natural resources and environment, and also sustainable communities and hazard mitigation. So there are a lot of cross-linking elements. But today we want to talk about flood tools and flood management. We have two different presentations with some fantastic expertise. Before we go there, I wanted to thank Christine and Ohio APA for sponsoring us again. You run an amazing YouTube series with phenomenal content. So I urge folks to look at the presentations. So with that, if we could go to the next slide, I want to tell you just a little bit about the Water and Planning Network. It was created in 2017 out of an initiative by APA to look at how to embed water content into planning more effectively. It's a free network of water and land use professionals. We try to be interdisciplinary, or as some people like to call it, transdisciplinary. Um, and you don't need to be an APA member to join. There's a link down below if you want to join. Just email us and let us know. There are about 500 or so network members, and mostly we offer newsletters 3 or 4 times a year, webinars about 3 or 4 a year if we can um, offer that content and fit into Ohio APA's busy webinar schedule. And you can also follow us on Twitter as noted. Um, so with that background, I want to turn it over to Manny, who has helped. He's a steering committee member of our Water and Planning Network of many years. Um, and he will introduce our speakers today. And again, I welcome you to the session, and I think you'll find it very enriching. Manny, take it away.
Well, thank you, folks. Once again, thank you, Christine, on Ohio EPA, as well as Bill and the whole Water and Planning Network Steering Committee for this opportunity. My name is Manny Patoli. I'm an industry assistant professor with the Center for Urban Science and Progress at New York University's Tandon School of Engineering. And I am very fortunate enough to work with these two lovely colleagues that are going to present to you today. First, Dr. Yuki Miura, an assistant professor at the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at the Center for Urban Science and Progress at New York University. She's also a faculty board member at the Volatility and Risk Institute at New York University's Stern School of Business, a member of New York City's panel on climate change, and advisor to New York City's Department of Environmental Protection. Previously, she worked at Morgan Stanley in climate risk management, as well as in quantitative risk strategy. She holds a PhD and Master of Philosophy and Master of Science from Columbia University, and comes to us all from Japan. Her research intersects at the point of engineering, climate science, finance, and social sciences, where we both share an interest there, and develops data-driven strategies to mitigate natural hazards and build resilient cities. By coupling advancing modeling with in-depth understanding of socioeconomic factors, she provides an actionable solutions for both public and private institutions as well as cities, and has collaborated with various institutions such as the National Center for of Atmospheric Research and governments of New York State and New York City. Her work has been recognized here and afar in publications in leading journals as well as the New Yorker and New York Times. Um, in addition to them, we also have Noel Law, who is a current mechanical engineering PhD student at the Center for Urban Science and Progress at New York University's Tandon School of Engineering, and is a member of Dr. Mura's Climate, Energy, and Risk Analytics Lab here in New York City. Her research focuses on the intersection of generative AI, graph neural networks, and geospatial modeling to simulate and communicate flood impacts and improve hazard risk assessments. She has contributed to several interdisciplinary journals since joining us here at CUSP and the Sierra Lab in the spring, including interactive flood visualization, infrastructural vulnerability analysis, and synthetic storm scenario generation. Previously, she's earned her MS in computer science from Tandon here in New York City, and spent 2 years at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, developing various algorithms for global public health and uncertainty estimation applications. Thank you, and please welcome my colleagues today who will be speaking to you on some very interesting and contemporary pertinent topics on flood management. Professor Dr. Miura, please take it away.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Manny. So thank you very much, APA as well, for having me and having us. Today we will be talking about flood risks and overarching different kinds of topics, but overall everything's going to be around flood risks. We will be talking how to identify it, how to measure it, how to even manage. So my first part is going to be overview of all these topics. And then afterwards, Noah is going to talk a couple different tools more in detail so that you'll be more familiar. Thank you. So here I have 4 pictures, and those are all taken in New York City. The left top is Rockaway. You can see a lot of single-family houses, and that's in Barrier Island. And then next to it is a tunnel that's between Manhattan and New Jersey. And then we have on the bottom subway station, which is South Ferry Station. It's located in the south tip of Manhattan. And then last picture, we have aerial picture in the night, taken from the sky, of course, but also shooting the sky line of Lower Manhattan. And that was all taken in before Hurricane Sandy. And then if we go back and forth, after Hurricane Sandy, this is exactly the same locations, and this is what happened. Rockaway, all the single-family houses are destroyed from storm surges. And then we have the flooded tunnel, and there are multiple tunnels around Manhattan, connecting New Jersey, and also Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island, that side. And all of them are completely flooded. And big thing about this flooding was the water was salt water. So that really was harmful for a lot of different utility system inside the tunnel as well. It took a really long time to be restored. And South Ferry Station, left bottom, and it's exactly same escalator. It's really sad to see this. And especially South Ferry Station was renovated 1 year before. And although it was brand new, it didn't have, resilient planning around to this superstorm Hurricane Sandy. And the last picture, we have aerial picture. You can see that there is a power outage in the entire Lower Manhattan. You can see the bottom line here. And that was caused by the explosion and the power outage in the area coming from the utility system in Midtown. So flood risk we are facing, and it's not only about New York City's problem. And if we look at the history, and here is the statistics of costliest hurricane in the history. So if you look at the name and also years, you might be familiar with probably most of them. And I just wanted to note here that I have 7 hurricanes here, but 5 out of 7 hurricanes occurred since 2017. So all of them are pretty recent, and even the oldest one is 2005, Katrina. And I always get questions, so I'm just answering now, but damage values are already adjusted for inflation. So it's not because inflation is a lot that all these, new hurricane damages are really high. So it tells you that flood risk have been amplified. So given that, I wanted to talk about what we can do and then what's going on. So there are quite a bit of knowledge gaps. Institutions, community really need to address those flood risks. We have seen a lot of news, very devastating news this year already as well. But there are quite a bit of challenging points. The first one is lack of reliable weather and exposure data. So in general, those risks, flooding, hurricanes, are not really, happening as often as we think. So, and then also it's not that we have 1,000 years of data already recorded. So there is first unreliable weather data available. And then also evolving environmental conditions, climate change, a lot of things are changing. So those historically recorded data is not particularly reliable sometimes too. Exposure data is a different thing. It's about the buildings or infrastructure, all these data. It's a lot of times siloed or it's not even recorded, so data is not available a lot of times. Second point is computationally expensive simulations. I will introduce several flood models later, but not only flood models, but a lot of climate related those models are computationally very expensive. You need very big computers to run all these, and then it's not really for everyone as well. The last part is non-standardized methodology is really available to manage the climate risks, compound hazards, cascading effects, and decision-making under deep uncertainty. There is a decision-make framework, but everyone has very different goals, very different methodology, and then of course, it's very uncertain as well. So there is no such standardized methodology. So with that, on my lab, Climate, Energy, and Risk Analytics Lab, and we've been talking very depressing thing, but we are trying to solve all these issues and critical gaps. And here I have three thrusts to manage all these risks. The first one is identification. We need to know where is going to be impacted, and then what kind of buildings, community are going to be impacted. We need to know what is going to happen. That's the identification part. Number two is the measurement. Once you know what's going to happen, then you want to know what is the impact from those events. So here I have two maps, but essentially this is showing the damage to buildings or infrastructure, and then also indicating flooded area with depths. And the last part, once you know, for example, when hurricane is coming, and then how much of losses are you expecting, like you all know all this information, then naturally the third part is going to be how to manage all these risks. So we will talk how we can figure out, best solution to take and what kind of strategy we can really implement. So we will get there. And my work has been integrating a lot of different aspects, and it's very interdisciplinary from civil, mechanical, environmental engineering, data science, and also most importantly, those solutions have to be practical. So I've been working with stakeholders from public agencies to local communities, and I'm closely working with New York City Office of the Mayor. So I will touch on very high level all these three thrusts, starting with identification, exposure modeling. So here we are talking about roof materials. Why roof materials do we really even care? Look at those two pictures here. We have a California fires that's happened this year, early this year in Malibu. If you look at this, those buildings, they are on the same street, and one is in concrete, and then another is asphalt singles. And you can see that even though it's on the same street next to each other, because of different materials, the outcomes are significantly different. And it's the same thing for Hurricane Dorian, and it's different hazards. But in Bahamas 2019, wooden structure, concrete structure, outcomes are very different. If we know all these information, not really, but you can tell rooftop, roofing materials are actually critical if you want to know what is going to happen in terms of damage, but those informations are very limited. So we created RoofNet dataset, which is a global multimodal dataset for rooftop roof material classification. Noel is going to be talking about this more in detail, so I'm gonna just touch very briefly. But essentially what it does is give you all these roof material information globally, and so that if you'd like to know what is going to happen with flood or wildfire. This one particularly works for any kinds of natural hazards, and you can identify different vulnerability using this data set. Here I have 14 RoofNet classes, and from asphalt, concrete tiles to more nature-based like wood tiles. And moving on to measurement from identification, and I have a couple models here, but let's start from rapid flood modeling. So I briefly mentioned, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. And I briefly mentioned that a lot of flood modeling tools are computationally very expensive. And like how expensive is that is usually around one simulation. Of course, it really depends on the area, but targeted areas, and then also the granularity. But for example, in this case, Lower Manhattan, and a lot of models, if it's granular enough to identify building by building information, those simulations could take hours. And if you expand the area, even it would get to like days. So it really is expensive. And although those flood simulation is really critical for real-time forecasting to, send the emergency rescue, or even for future scenario analysis. You'd like to run multiple scenarios. You might not want to just rely on the one scenarios. If you want to, for example, run 10, 100 scenarios to identify what you are going to plan, then bottleneck is going to be those computation time. So to tackle this issue, we created GISSR. This is physics-based and also applied to GIS model, which is very fast flood simulation. And GISSR requires very less computation resource, and it can run very quickly. For example, this map was created with my regular laptop, no big computer, within 0.01 second, no parallel computing by any sorts. And here I'm also validating just in case. And of course, we want to make sure that there's rapid flood simulation to be still accurate. And that shows that any significant water depths are already captured. And there are some gaps between, but those areas we figured out the depth is very shallow. I'm going to show you a couple case studies. And GISSR can also give you time history of water evolving at any given location. So here I picked 3 locations in Lower Manhattan around Canal Street Station, South Ferry Station, which was the station from those 4 pictures in the beginning. And then number 3 right next to Con Edison, which is the utility system supplying all the electricity to Lower Manhattan that time. And as you can see, we have 3 scenarios on the map from very light blue to darker blue with Hurricane Sandy with sea level rise 2050 and 2100. And all given locations, we have also the water evolution with the surge height. And you can see that with Hurricane Sandy and also additional sea level rise, you would see very high surge height. And this case is no protective measures involved. And if we move to the next slide, we have case study number 2, which comes with elevated coastline by 1 meter. So the entire area is elevated now on the coastline. And then as you can see, Hurricane Sandy case, which is the lightest blue, is now eliminated significantly. There's not much of inundated area. Of course, there are still some, but a lot less. And then on the other hand, if we focus on like locations like number 2 and 3, even though Hurricane Sandy's impact is a lot less now, but with sea level rise, it's not going to be sufficient protection. So GISSR can give you essentially a little bit of sneak peek of different types of protective measures that you are interested in, to see if it's going to be functional or not functional. And all these simulation doesn't take any time. And those were above ground. And this one, I have also 2 case studies for underground. So the light colored area is the surface water, but also now we have subway systems. GISSR can also simulate underground infrastructure. And here in New York City's case, it's subway. And light blue color lines indicate the inundated subway lines, tunnels, and then red dots indicate subway stations that are directly flooded from those surface flooding. And then we have blue dots. Those are the stations that are not in the flood areas, but they are eventually flooded because of connectivity of all these tunnels. And green dot stations are dry stations, and then gray lines are also dry tunnels. And we have sandy with sea level rise 2050 and 2100 again. And as you can compare, you see that as long as we have more sea level rise, there's going to be a lot more directly flooded subway stations and also extended inundated tunnels. And what if we have some kind of protective measure? So if we move on to the next one, here we have Lower East Side Resiliency Project, which has been actually under construction. And some part of this protective measure has been already constructed in the city, not the entire thing. So this brown line indicates this resiliency project at the completion. And you can see that it significantly reduces the surface water flooding behind those walls, but there's subway flooded subway was actually already on the west side. So this resiliency project is not going to be directly benefiting so much to subway system. Although Sandy's case, we still see a lot of reduction on the east side. And with sea level rise, that's not really, that's going to be limited. And we are currently updating this rapid flood model GISSR to include also pluvial flooding and also riverine flooding. And oftentimes pluvial flooding takes even longer flood simulation time. So once we are done with this, it will be very helpful for a lot of planning purposes. Another measurement, we will touch briefly on compound flood and vulnerability modeling. So in New York City, we face different types of flooding, and we have Hurricane Sandy, that was coastal flooding types of hurricanes. So we had a lot of storm surge, and then that impacted a lot of people. And on the other hand, we also had Hurricane Ida that triggered pluvial flooding and basically heavy rain to flood a lot of regions. And that also impacted people and infrastructure. So we are working on to see when those hurricanes like storm surge type of hurricane and also heavy rain type of hurricane could happen together. Sometimes hurricanes have heavy rain and also very strong wind. So it's the combination, but those compound flooding could happen as well. So we have adopted this prior work from Milanese and then also Bonamelli on vulnerability. And this essentially shows you the function of water depth and velocity for safety. And if you see the graph and those zones, and yellow meaning zone 1, people in cars are going to be safe. And zone 2 would be safe for a child life, but people in cars are going to be unsafe. And zone 3, child life in danger, and 4, adult life in danger. So you can see it's the combination. If the water depth is high and then also velocity is high, it's going to be a lot more risk to any kinds of people too. So we are adapting this into our model and identifying the flood area, and then also identifying the velocity and depths, and then having those information, we can identify vulnerability. So I'm going to show a couple of case studies here as well. So this is a Hurricane Sandy's case, which is coastal flood. As you can see from left to right, we have max depths, max velocity, and then vulnerability map. And natural, but you can see that all these impacted areas are coastline. Next. And then with sea level rise of 2080, you can see that this inundated area and impacted areas are going to be significantly expanded. And then if we look into heavy rain, which we are adopting Hurricane Ida's case for pluvial flood, the inundated areas look very different compared to coastal flooding. Here you can see that a lot of flood inundated areas, even inland, because rain comes in anywhere, not necessarily from river. So you can see that max depths, max velocity, and then even vulnerability map extending to inland. And then if we happen to have something similar, but at the same time or one after another, which could totally happen, not this scale, and then of course not exactly the same, but we are just doing some case study for Hurricane Sandy coastal flooding and Hurricane Ida's pluvial flooding. So that gives us extended inundation area from coast to inland, and also flood depth is going to be deeper, and also velocity is going to be faster. And that, of course, gives us a lot more purple area in vulnerability map. And with sea level rise, this is going to be even more amplified. So let's move on to damage analysis, which is also part of measurement. And this is going to be quick. So we have a model that tells you direct and also indirect damage from flood areas. So once you have flood simulation, identifying the area, then we can translate those information into dollar amount, and also how many people are going to be impacted in terms of number. And then in terms of the damage losses, we have physical damage, income losses, inventory losses, renovation cost, revenue loss, relocation cost, and then indirect economic losses. The map in the middle shows only physical damage. So this indicates only the building damage percentage. But based on this, we can calculate all these different indirect losses. And the last one, indirect economic loss, indicates macroeconomic model, so that we check into different sectors. For example, if power sectors are malfunctional, we can expect that other business sectors and other critical infrastructure are going to be also impacted. And so we calculate all these economic losses too. And those are only for the surface level, and we can also model for underground. So for the case of subway, we identified already flooded tunnels and station. And based on this, we can calculate inoperability time when subway system is going to be shut down. So here, that's the summation of pumping time and also restoration and repairing time. And based on this, we calculate economic loss due to subways inoperability and through economic activities. So there's damage assessment require a lot of data. For example, building information, where it's built, what is the critical elevation of those buildings, and who's the occupants, what is the usage of the building, if there are some kind of business activities, what those activities are. And a lot of times these information are hard to obtain. And in case you have no data, then that's not going to be an issue. And we have another model that's for missing data for damage assessment. So what we do here is using satellite imagery pre-hazard. So we don't need to even have satellite image for post-hazard. We can just use normal time satellite image to identify potential damage to buildings. So here I have case studies from hazard level 3 to 5 to identify which building is going to be most impacted. We have damage indication from no damage to destroyed. Finally, we already identify and then measure a lot of damage. So we are going to manage those risks. And the first one is going to be actionable and scalable return on investment framework for resilience. So this framework has been developed with 12 different agencies in New York City and involving a lot of uncertainties, but for users, it's very easy to use. So eventually, the goal of this framework is to identify optimal strategy that minimizes all the potential risks and damage, given any kinds of constraints that you may have. And a lot of different agencies showed interest and also share that they have very different goals. And so we made sure that this framework works for different stakeholders and different goals. So starting from strategy selection on this chart, once you have some idea of what kind of predictive measures you want to install, that's going to be here. So you can pick, for example, seawalls or elevated promenade or maybe retrofit single buildings. It can be any different kinds of scale. And then once you parameterize those strategy, then number two, we will identify what kind of storms are going to happen in that region for the time duration of your interest. And then we will calculate all these possible storms outcomes, meaning where is going to be flooded. Once we identify that, we will move on to damage assessment, number three, and to convert this flooded information into something we can manage. So it will be potentially number of people impacted, or number of buildings impacted, or economic losses in the area. Once we get those information, and then we will evaluate if this strategy is suitable for our goal, reflecting the constraints, reflecting the optimality for the stakeholder, and then also making sure that this is something practical to make sure that it's going to be actually implemented. And for this framework, I have multiple papers already available, and there are also a couple of things coming out too. So we have a pilot analysis for this framework in New York City, and we imagine a couple of scenarios. And for this particular case, we picked the protective measure as elevated promenade, which is something New York City has been designing and also constructing already. And we will identify where is going to be the best location for these elevated promenade, and also what is the elevation, what is the height of it. And then objective function to solve this one is going to be to minimize summation of implementation cost or investment cost of this protective measure, and also expected damage cost, and given all these potential hurricanes and flood events. And then time horizon, this could be anything, it's very much changeable, but here I have it until 2100. And then the constraints are going to be, those elevation is going to be up to 5 meters, not going to address, and then also protect measures to be within Lower Manhattan, and then under prescribed budget. To run this pilot analysis, we needed quite a bit of data sets, including building information, infrastructure data, and geography and demographics, and then historical storm data. And to identify damage for this pilot analysis, we have two different types of damage during this time period until 2100. The expected damage losses to buildings and infrastructure, that includes assets, inventories, and then another one is economic losses due to suspended business operations and interconnectivities of infrastructure and businesses. And here's a pilot analysis. And on the left side, we have a graph that shows budget and cost in $1 billion. The red dots and line indicates the damage cost. And then the measure cost, which is investment cost to protect measure, is in orange line. So as you can see, if there is more budget, the orange line goes up, and then damage cost with different types of measure cost is also going down with budget getting higher. The blue line indicates the total cost of measure cost and damage cost. So for this optimization framework, we are trying to minimize the total cost of this orange and red lines. And how they could look like is indicated in those 4 maps. We have number 1 with $500 million, and that will be focusing more on Lower East Side, and then that with more budget is extending more. And just to note, this number is very much not showing the real number. We need more data to actually have a real number for construction of those seawalls. Last part, another management, but very different approach. We are here focusing on more on communication and awareness, and which is going to be 3D flat risk visualization. And here you can also scan this QR code, and Noah is going to show you a demo later, so you can see this more clearly. But essentially what we are doing here is 3D interactive flat map web tool that everyone can access, and then try out different types of scenarios and identify the depths, velocity, vulnerability that we already talked, and then also even try out the seawalls impacts. And this would be very useful for planners and also community to be aware of the potential risks. And then we are also open to include more simulations data too. So quick wrap up, we talk about different thrust. We are overarching this entire flood risks, but from identification to measurement and management. And in identification part, we introduced RoofNet, which is a global data set of roof material. And then for measurement, we discussed about GISSR, which is rapid flood model that gives you different types of flood simulation with or without protective measure. And then also we have vulnerability modeling for compound flood risks. And for management, we introduce optimization framework for best solution against flooding, and also 3D flat map for awareness and preparedness. We have more work. We have been exploring a lot of different types of climate risks. So feel free to scan Discord. And I think Christine has been also posting some link. Thank you so much for our lab. So please feel free to explore that. And now I hand it over to Noelle.
All right, thank you so much. So if everyone can hear me, my name is Noelle Law, and I'm a first-year PhD student at NYU Tandon, working under the supervision of Dr. Yuki Miura. Today, I'm going to be talking about designing for impact, specifically as it relates to exposure modeling and interactive flood visualization. So my advisor earlier discussed how the SARA lab really focuses on 3 main research thrusts: risk identification, risk measurement, and risk management. I'm going to instead focus today on the first and the third thrust, identification and management, and showing how they come together in 2 complementary projects. So first, we'll look at how building characteristics, particularly roof materials, can be used to identify vulnerability and strengthen exposure models for hazards like earthquakes, fires, and floods. And then we'll shift to management through an interactive 3D flood visualization platform. This tool, which is currently focused on Lower Manhattan, simulates impacts of extreme rainfall, storm surge, and evolving coastal configurations, helping decision makers and communities ultimately try and plan better and adapt. So together, these projects demonstrate how targeted hazard identification and effective management strategies can better support data-informed planning and empower a clearer understanding of both global and local climate risks. So why do roof materials matter for hazard resilience?
Let's start by discussing the scale of the problem. In 2024 alone, natural disasters caused over $300 billion in global damage, according to NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information. And these losses aren't just coming from the larger headline events. Urbanization and growing insurance gaps are quietly amplifying both the risk and the exposure in communities worldwide. So why does this matter for us? Because the materials of our buildings are made of play such a huge role in determining how much damage a structure sustains during events like hurricanes, wildfires, and earthquakes. As you can see in the image in the upper right about how materials determine the structural damage building during something like a wildfire. But even beyond this, and beyond the immediate disaster itself and how well a building sustains, these same materials do create bottlenecks in supply chains when communities actually try to rebuild after a disaster. And there's a huge data gap. So roofing materials are critical, but poorly documented. And so right now, most material level data comes from manual annotation or field surveys, which simply can't keep up with the scale that we actually need for effective mitigation strategies. This means that things like risk models or recovery cost estimates are missing a key input that could make them more accurate, more actionable, and more equitable. And a quick note right here, while all materials influence building risk, roofs, facades, we opt to use roof material data as a primary indicator because open and accessible street view and facade data is far less common than aerial imagery, which leaves a critical gap in understanding vulnerability at a global scale if we just relied on facade data. And so this is where our work comes in, where we aim to find a scalable, automated way to close this gap and bring this material level detail into disaster resilience planning. So I'm going to be presenting on RoofNet. Dr. Mira has already prefaced it, which is a global multimodal dataset for roof material classification. RoofNet's high-level architecture starts with high-resolution satellite imagery paired with language descriptions that identify both the roof materials and the descriptive features, such as the location. From there, the data feeds into the roof material classification task, which uses a mix of expert validation and vision language model-assisted classification, which let us train and evaluate models at a global scale. The result is an accessible open data set that can support downstream tasks such as scenario analysis. Think integrating material vulnerability into hazard models, estimating recovery costs, or mapping heat exposure in urban areas. RoofNet is designed to be both globally representative and practically useful for disaster risk applications. First, to talk about global scope and diversity, this is the first large-scale globally representative roof material dataset that spans across 14 different material classes. It includes over 51,000 samples covering 184 geographically diverse sites in 112 countries. And that geographic breadth means that models trained on this dataset can actually better generalize globally. Next, for multimodal annotations, these samples include metadata on roof shape, the presence of solar panels, locations, and material coherence, which provides researchers with the ability to do a much deeper analysis. And in order to keep the dataset high quality but still scalable, we use a hybrid vision language model pipeline paired with rule-based validation. This preserves accuracy while enabling a much faster, more scalable workflow than manual labeling alone. We also introduced an unknown class to kind of capture this uncertainty rather than forcing a vision language model to guess when maybe the data sample is too noisy or too low resolution. And so finally, this dataset is designed to be scalable towards future hazard shifts and not overfit where disasters have historically occurred. And so this positions us to really anticipate and prepare for hazards in regions that haven't really experienced them before, but may in the future. So before we go further into RoofNet, I do want to provide a background on vision language models and why they're so beneficial to our work, because I do talk about them a lot throughout this presentation. So traditional computer vision models are trained to recognize patterns in images alone. But many real-world tasks actually require understanding both what something looks like and what something's described as. And so vision language models are trained on this paired image text data, learning a shared representation where images and descriptions live in the same embedding space, which means a picture of a red roof tile and the phrase red roof tile end up very close in that space. And so this multimodal alignment lets the model connect visual patterns to actual semantic meaning, which is really great because it allows for zero-shot learning, which we can give the model a new label it's never explicitly been trained on, like a photo of a metal roof in Auckland, New Zealand. And it can often recognize it without additional training because it understands the relationship between the words and the images, like what the roofs tend to look like in New Zealand or similar colder environments, and what metal roofing looks like in these colder environments. It also supports few-shot learning, so if we give it just a handful of examples of a new class, it can usually generalize pretty quickly by leveraging prior knowledge from both modalities. And so this is especially important for globally diverse and data-scarce contexts, where collecting thousands of labeled images aren't always feasible. And so by leveraging multimodal data, vision language models can actually bridge this gap between rich textual descriptions and visual features to better enable scale. But to really ground the use of vision language models a bit more, the same material that we're using can look dramatically different depending on where it's found. So for example, in hotter climates like Santiago, San Juan, or Mumbai, metal roofs might look lighter colored or weathered to reflect heat, sometimes patchwork repairs and change in the visual texture. But in cold climates like Warsaw, you might see these darker, more uniform tones, sometimes with snow load considerations that kind of change the slope or the sheen of the roof. And places like Sydney showcase how architectural styles, cooler temperatures, and cultural preferences may influence roof geometry and finish even further. So this is a really small example to show the importance of global coverage because you can't just rely on a visual match from one country and assume it will work in another. By pairing imagery with text that specifies both the material type and the location context, we can train models to better generalize across climates, cultures, and geographies. So what does the pipeline actually look like? We selected cities from architecturally and geographically diverse regions worldwide, really ensuring variation in climate, construction styles, and urban morphology. And to address gaps in underrepresented material classes, we targeted samples using Google Street View inspection with expert input. And so the initial sampling was population weighted. Later, we did material focused additions for some new locations, which means certain locations are a little bit more overrepresentative for a given material class, just because you have these really long tail distributions in these material classes that are really focused on a specific area. So once that was done, for each selected region, we use the Overpass API to actually pull down building metadata and sample high-resolution satellite imagery tiles from the OpenStreetMaps. We later augmented the original OpenStreetMaps data with the XBD building damage assessment dataset that Dr. Mura had briefly touched on earlier. Due to the difference in resolution from the samples we were pulling down from OpenStreetMaps and then the resolution from this disaster dataset, which has a far lower resolution. And the goal of this work is really to be able to better extend to disaster and risk analysis. So after retrieving images from the Overpass API, we applied Grounding Dino, which is an open source vision language model for object detection. So when I talked about vision language models earlier, I mostly focused on object classification. This one focuses on object detection, and it basically uses prompts to better localize objects. So you can see right here, there's an image of a roof that's pulled down from OSM, and it's slightly off center. And so what Grounding Dino is able to do is, based on the prompt that it's given, it's able to filter the image and kind of take out some of the noise and better focus and allow the data set to really center the roof in question. So we then post-process the image to remove any sort of low resolution or noisy samples and resolve many structural ambiguities, which can be really common in dense urban environments. And so think houses and buildings that are really close to each other. You can have multiple of them in the image. We did leave some of these structural ambiguities to allow for robustness and classification task. And this helped with a cleaner, higher quality inputs for downstream annotation and modeling. So moving on to the next one, once the majority of the images were filtered, we manually created a fine-tuning subset of about 6,000 samples for high-quality labels for vision language model training. And these samples were used to fine-tune remote clip, which is a variant of contrastive language image pre-training, which I had talked about in the background information. But this specific clip that we fine-tuned, or contrastive language image pre-train, was specifically for remote sensing data. And so it pairs the satellite imagery with shared text in the embedding space. And so while this manual curation required significant effort upfront, it enables far greater scalability downstream by allowing fine-tuned model to better automate accurate labeling across a much larger global data set. So finally, the remaining samples in the dataset were classified using the fine-tuned model and then passed through rule-based verification process to flag improbable predictions. So think improbabilities like having shingles in Bermuda. So once we did that, a human-in-the-loop validation step further refined labels, ensuring quality control where classifications passed into the unknown image class were actually manually filtered. And if there seemed to be a huge repeated error in this unknown class, we would go back to see if this might have been a gap in our vision language model training and iterate accordingly. Finally, additional metadata synthesis is combining information from multiple sources, which includes the CLIP classification for satellite and multiple materials data, the XPD damage assessment dataset, and OpenStreetMaps to better enrich each specific sample. And textual annotations describing both material and context were created, producing the complete RoofNet. So what does the actual taxonomy look like in RoofNet? RoofNet's material classes cover natural and traditional materials, stone-based roofing, ceramic and manufactured tiles, sheet materials, and composite or synthetic roofing. These categories were chosen for their relevance to hazard response. For example, how a roof performs during heat waves, hurricanes, or fires depends not only on the material type, but also on its granularity. Because the same hazard may impact amorphous asphalt, which is kind of that bitumen sort of material, differently than asphalt shingles, making detailed material distinctions really critical for accurate vulnerability assessment. Looking more into the material distribution and the data set, for manufactured tiles, which include clay, asphalt, and concrete, we observe a dense concentration in Europe and significant representation in regions closer to the equator. And this distribution really reflects architectural preferences and climatic suitability, as tile materials are widely used in Mediterranean, tropical, subtropical climates for their durability, thermal properties, and cultural relevance. Onto synthetic and flat roofs. This include materials like concrete and amorphous asphalt. So the difference between the tiling in the previous one, the concrete there, that's concrete tiles. This focuses on that flat amorphous concrete. This follows a similar distribution pattern appearing across diverse climates and geographies. In materials, these materials make up the majority of the data set because it reflects their widespread use in both urban and industrial settings, particularly where flat or low slope designs are favored for cost, durability, or space utilization. Moving on to sheet materials, this includes metal roofing. It shows really a broad global distribution, appearing across a wide range of climates and geographies. And the versatility of many sheet materials makes them really advantageous in both extremely hot climates where they can reflect heat and very cold climates where they can offer durability and resistance to snow and ice loads. And we kind of saw that earlier on when I was talking about vision language models. And so for traditional and natural materials such as thatch, stone slates, and vegetative roofs, they tend to be relatively rare in the data set and form a long tail distribution. This limited representation made class balance training essential for fine-tuning the vision language model in order to ensure that these materials were learned as effectively as the more common classes like amorphous concrete. Okay, so taking a look at metadata, the goal of RoofNet's metadata isn't really to replace existing resources, but really to leverage complementary data such as data from OpenStreetMap to enrich the dataset with multimodal descriptors beyond just location and material information that serve as critical priors in assessing structural vulnerability and hazard exposure. For example, footprint area and building height can help approximate volumetric mass and estimate potential wind or flood loads. And roof shape influences performances under wind stress, while details like solar panel presence or multiple roof materials, which we identified through a prompt tuning of remote clip, add important context for resilience modeling. To wrap up this project that focuses on risk identification, there are three main takeaways, which is it's the first publicly available global multimodal roof dataset with over 51,000 samples from 184 geographically and architecturally diverse areas, which pairs high-resolution satellite imagery with descriptive text annotators and making it an open resource for the research and resilience community. Second, it combines subject matter expert labeled imagery with a vision language modeled pipeline to classify across 14 different roof materials, in which the descriptions are enriched with metadata on building shape, height, solar panels, and footprint area, which enables more nuanced structural assessments. Third, it was designed with real-world applications in mind, especially with focus on vulnerability assessment, disaster response, and reconstruction planning. The goal is to better equip policymakers, insurers, and resilience planners with actionable infrastructure data and to better provide a resource for future work like hazard-specific VLM vision language model training and dynamic resampling of areas where the climate is shifting. So to fully summarize, RoofNet is designed to be accurate, scalable, and directly useful for building resilience in a changing climate. This brings us to the second part of my talk, and we'll shift from risk identification to risk management. In this project, we focus on overcoming fragmented, highly technical, and often inaccessible flood information by translating advanced modeling outputs into intuitive, interactive visualizations. And the aim of this is to really equip decision makers, communities, and planners with the tools they can actually use to prepare for, respond to, and recover from these flood events. So there's been a great deal of flood events in the headlines lately, but I do want to carry over from the discussion Dr. Mira had earlier and focus on 2 record-breaking storms in New York City that highlight very different types of flooding because they set the stage for the work that I'll be sharing later on. As mentioned previously, Hurricane Sandy struck New York City in October 2012 and brought a devastating amount of coastal flooding, as you can see in the image on the left. The storm caused 52 deaths and over 89 billion in estimated damages with current inflation, and impacts cascading across the entire New York City metropolitan area. In contrast, Hurricane Ida, seen on the right, happened in 2021 and was defined by extreme rainfall rather than storm surge. It had 3.5 inches of rain per hour, which really exceeds New York City's sewer system capacity that can only hold 1.75 inches per hour. Unfortunately, these impacts are not felt equally. So communities with fewer resources are often more vulnerable and face longer recovery times and more severe consequences when infrastructure and essential services fail. So think food pantries shutting down, extended power outages, or disruption to life-sustaining medications, which really disproportionately affect under-resourced neighborhoods and older adults. So going from the local setting and looking more globally, floods are one of the most frequent and costly natural disasters globally. And changing climate is really only making the problem worse as it leads to intensifying storm surge, heavy rainfall, and sea level rise impacts. But the information we have to understand these risks is really often fragmented, highly technical, and inaccessible to the public. Which brings us to the need as to why communities require accessible science-based tools that can make local flood risk clear and actionable. Decision makers ultimately depend on visual evidence-based insights to prioritize investments in mitigation strategies, and education and awareness are critical for empowering people to take protective actions before disasters occur. So what's our solution? With that in mind, I want to introduce Manhattan Underwater that Dr. Mira had discussed earlier, which is an interactive virtual platform that allows users to explore flood impacts and test resilience strategies for New York City in an accessible and engaging way. While the current focus is on Manhattan, we're actively expanding to cover the entire New York City area. And in upcoming slides, you'll see how the application is really designed to scale to a more global context. So to provide a high-level overview and using specifically Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Ida as the case studies, our workflow begins with collecting data from NOAA, USGS, and other sources. This includes digital elevation models, sea level rise, and land use datasets. The raw data is then pre-processed through cleaning, reprojection, and meshing before being passed into a hydrodynamic simulation. For this work, we specifically use HECROS as the simulator, but the broader framework is realistically model agnostic and could integrate other modeling tools. So once these simulations are generated, we validate them against FEMA's ground truth flood extents, tidal gauge station data, and RMSE overlap metrics. The final stage, which is the main area that I focused on, is visualizing the simulated flood impacts across different scenarios in a 3D environment, which allows us to more clearly communicate risks to both technical and non-technical audiences. What makes this work unique? The platform was built to be open source and accessible with the goal of maximizing transparency, reproducibility, and adoption by resources, planners, and community members. It runs entirely in the browser using tiled imagery through Cesium Ion to ensure smooth performance without any sort of specialized software. The visualization is interactive and scenario aware, so users can toggle between climate scenarios or add protective measures like seawalls, and real-time rendering really makes it easy to compare the impacts side by side, which we'll see in a demo later. And we can visualize not only flood depth, but also velocity and vulnerability, giving a more complete picture of risk. Finally, the design has been iterated on through stakeholder inclusion, as it was co-developed with the New York City Mayor's Office and community partners, and tested with people across a wide range of ages and technical backgrounds, ranging from high school students to seasoned professionals. This helped better ensure that the tool is intuitive and valuable for a wide range of audiences. For this work, once again, we did use HECROS as our hydrodynamic modeler, but it's important to note that the visualization platform itself is model agnostic. It just needs a geo-referenced flood extent file, such as GeoTIFF, to display the results. And so the process starts with collecting the event conditions, for example, Hurricane Sandy under a specific sea level rise scenario, along with detailed terrain and land cover modeling. These inputs are passed into the hydrodynamic simulator to generate the predicted flood extents. And then finally, to ensure accuracy, the simulated flood extent for Sandy, for example, is validated against FEMA-provided benchmark maps using overlap index. This metric helps better quantify how closely our modeled results match observed flooding and giving us confidence in using the outputs for scenario analysis and visualization. Beyond mapping just maximum flood depth, we also incorporate maximum velocity and vulnerability mapping to create a more complete picture of flood impacts. The first map shows maximum flood depth in meters, which is critical for understanding inundation extent and potential damage to structures, while the second map adds maximum velocity in meters per second. This is important because even relatively shallow water can become dangerous when moving quickly, as was seen in Dr. Mira's earlier discussion on how vulnerability is calculated as a mix of both depth and velocity. And finally, the third map combines depth and velocity into vulnerability classification, ranging from areas where people are safe in cars to areas where adult life is at risk. Because we include velocity and vulnerability alongside depth, we can better capture the true hazard to people and infrastructure and better help inform evacuation planning, emergency response, and protective infrastructure design. And in order to make the platform a little bit more user-friendly for a wide range of persons, we ran a structured UI/UX workshop to gather targeted feedback. During the workshop, we asked participants to evaluate three main areas: clarity and communication of the interface, any missing resources or information, and usability issues along with desired new features. All feedback was collected and annotated in Figma, which allowed us to directly link comments to interface elements, and you can see some examples of the feedback we received in the right side. Mentioned previously, our participants during this workshop really represented a wide range of ages and technical experience levels, from high school students to experienced coders, which gave us a lot of diverse perspectives. And these insights were critical in guiding iterative design changes and improving accessibility so the platform worked for anyone regardless of background. All right, so I am gonna do an in PowerPoint follow along rather than pulling up the application for ease, but the QR code and the website is listed to the left, so please feel free to pull it up and follow along on your own time. So let's see, once this starts, I'm going to start on the page who the team is about the project and what the current scope of the project is. And next I'm going to our background and mechanics page. A great deal of this information I already discussed earlier in the presentation. And you can see I have sensitivity evaluation, velocity depth information, and any sort of limitations in the modeling process. And now I'm going to go to the more fun part, I suppose, where we can go through and select a scenario. So I'm going to select Hurricane Sandy at sea level rise of 2050, and then have it show me the Freedom Tower. You can realistically go anywhere in Lower Manhattan in the app, but I have a few identifiable places selected that have different use cases and important in providing context in flooding scenarios. And so you can see that here you have the 2D raster overlay in the bottom corner of the application. And what I'm doing right now is I'm clicking on different areas of the flood. And so the inspector will show the depth, the velocity, and the vulnerability at that given latitude and longitude in which you click. Right now I'm overlaying the velocity map to be able to better see. You can see that there's a lot of overlap between velocity and depth. And then finally, I'm showing the vulnerability overlay. And you can see how quickly vulnerability changes within a small region. There's a legend down at the bottom that I'm pointing out that the purple, again, is a V4 zone, which means adult life is at risk. So down below, I'm showing the average depth at the location. So the location being the Freedom Tower selected. I take the average depth. You can see that there's quite diversity in how deep the water is around it. And so taking the average size person in Manhattan, which is about 5.8 feet, I go through and I overlay the flood extent on them. And so what I'm going through right now is I'm going to show how sea level rise changes this event. So you can see based on this that with 2080 sea level rise, it really does impact the amount of flooding around the Freedom Tower. And now I'm going to go over to East Village. What you can see right now is that there is a lot of damage in East Village from a storm surge scenario and 2080 sea level rise. And the building I'm circling right there happens to be a school. And so there's a wide variety of vulnerable population in the area in really quite deep waters. And so over there, as I'm going through and I'm scrolling and providing a little bit more context, I want to show what protective measures such as the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project can actually do. So the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project is the seawall that Dr. Mira had brought up earlier. And the green area, that's the raised park that is in process of being made right now, where instead of building just a wall itself, they worked with community members to make sure the entire community area was used as a park system. And then the smaller red lines are more traditional walls. You can see it protects a lot of the flood area, which is great, with a little bit of overlay coming down from around the edges of the wall. And so you can see without these sort of protective measures that it really does impact the area. And while I did discuss that, we have done a UI UX workshop to give us really diverse perspectives on things like improvements in usability. We're always looking for more feedback. So feel free to reach out to us via the contact page form, and we would really love any information or thoughts you may have. And so let's get back. Okay, there we go. So in summary of this work, we developed an open source interactive 3D flood impact visualization tool that allows users to explore both depth and velocity layers, compare future climate and infrastructure scenarios, and assess exposure via vulnerability impact. This work was co-developed with key stakeholders and the community to really ensure that it's usable and inclusive. But we would, again, really also love anyone's feedback. And while this work began with a focus on Lower Manhattan, it's definitely not meant to stay there. The framework is designed to be scalable, and we're expanding coverage to the entire New York City metropolitan region and ultimately aim to expand it to global cities. So later refinements will have expanded user contribution pipeline so that anyone will be able to upload geotiffs with metadata for moderated inclusion, making this more collaborative and a global resource. We're also building towards richer scenario modeling by integrating more socioeconomic and infrastructure scenarios. How can vegetation or low-lying parks diminish flood risk? Enabling not just a better protective measures simulation, but more of a holistic understanding of vulnerability and managing risk in different contexts. So for some final remarks on both RoofNet and our interactive 3D flood visualization, we have a shared goal of improving risk identification and management, in which we aim to understand material vulnerabilities at the building scale to better identify risk, and then visualize flood hazards and protective measure to better manage risk. These tools aim to make risk data more accessible, interpretable, and actionable. And so by combining this science-based analysis with clear communication strategy, we really aim to better provide resources to communities and decision makers to adapt, build resilience, and plan in a changing environment. And so thank you all for listening, and we're happy to take any questions at this time.
Thank you. All right, we have a couple minutes. This was great. Well, I'll take a deep breath, grab something to drink. So if everyone wants to jump back on here, at the top of this, before we started, we were talking about our backgrounds and where we went to school and what we did. And I have an environmental science degree before planning, and we were comparing war stories and things like that. But this really takes me back, and I gotta say, I am sure I'm not the only one on this line that is like, what are we talking about here? So let's break it down a little bit. When we have a professional that's working on tools like this, where have we seen it applied? Like, where's the applied version of this? Where have we taken this and, shown it to our decision makers, our elected officials, even taken this out and giving it to planning staff? And so where have we seen this very technical piece kind of put up into lay terms, I guess? And I'm going to try to get the rest of our panelists back on because I might have put them in jail or something by accident. So let me see what I've done with them. I'm sorry, guys. Do either one of you, or does anyone want to kind of take that on? Kind of the very practical application or outcomes?
Of course. So I'll start with the first project that I talked about with the roof material identification. And so one of the good things that can be done with that is if you know you have a natural disaster that's coming into play and you understand the satellite imagery of the area, you're able to extract out different roofs from that and better classify what the roof descriptions are. Then you can understand based on this disaster, what is the risk for each of these buildings for this community if a hurricane's coming into play? And then maybe how can that actually impact not only the damage to the buildings at the time, so how much they'll withstand that sort of storm, but also what does building up the community look like afterwards? Because it's not always the damage at the time of, it's also how do we actually build these homes back up? And so you can also look at, based on these processes, how can we better estimate and adapt accordingly? For the second one, that would be looking at things like the seawall integration. And so if you go to a given planner, you have a resource and we're looking to expand it to not only the seawall, which is already being put into play, but different protective measures such as parks, vegetation, or low-lying areas. So for example, if you have a low-lying park or a basketball court during a flooding event, and you have that in the simulated map, you could see during a different flood event how maybe that would absorb or take in a lot of water. Because for example, a low-lying basketball court would be able to take in water and people aren't going to be playing during a flood event. And so that's kind of a way that the community can look at how can we manage accordingly. It can also be in terms of evacuation. So if you have a given flood risk, if you're able to have applications that you can visualize maybe what areas that you're in, the potential risks associated with it, then you can better understand what your evacuation strategy is so you're not in an area when a disaster does strike. And so that's kind of the high level goal of those two projects, if that answers your question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So how do these two particular products, how do they differ from others that we know already exist? Like there's a question up here that says, what about the already off the shelf models like the Army Corps has? I'm sure there's a lot of kind of open source templates, I guess, available. So how does this take it a step further?
Sure.
Or be unique?
I can take that one.
Great.
So we presented, Noah presented two tools. I presented, I don't know, a bunch. But all of them have a very distinguished novelty. So maybe if we maybe talk about the Army Corp one, that's probably like HECRA's flood simulation, and that's publicly available. A lot of people use that, and it's a great program for sure. One different thing is like, as I emphasize quite a bit, computation resources. And even though, you want to know pretty precise flood area, but a lot of models publicly available, which is really great, but sometimes just take too long or sometimes requires too much CPU time that you might not have. So that's where we created GISSR for. So GISSR is not like a bust out method, so it's actually based on physics based. So it gives you pretty accurate physics bugged result, but it's very fast. And addition to that, like optimization framework, Bill was pitting me actually, but asking about HAZUS. HAZUS is also developed by FEMA. It's available and it's a little tricky to install. I get a lot of emails, but it's also a great resource. There's not many resources like that, so I'm very grateful that it's available. But also, usually it's like, you run one scenario, one simulation, and then identify if this protective measure works or not. And our model is very different in mechanism. So I didn't go too much in detail because I wanted to show different things, but happy to discuss more if anybody's interested, of course. But optimization one, we run like millions of scenarios because nobody knows what is going to happen in next year or even like next 20 years or 80 years. So to avoid, missing out all the possible things, what we did is essentially running every possible scenarios. So to run those, it requires a lot of computation time, but also we managed to have expected damage that's taken into account for all the uncertainties as well. So that's probably the big difference between what's, available right now. And I can comment on, of course, like RoofNet or other 3D map, etc. But maybe I will just stop here.
Christine, could I throw out a few comments here?
Absolutely. And then I do have a follow-up question.
I think that for the planning community, especially, this presentation is incredibly innovative because it, at least to me, shows that in one sense, we're trying to engage with the community better and we're trying to provide planning and scenario planning tools, but also we're requiring much more sophisticated modeling and analysis to go in that. So while we're trying to simplify, we're also making things much more complex on the analytical side. And it's the pairing of them that's essential. Also in developing the RoofNet model, which is critical in looking at wildfire and flood response. So this really lends a whole new dimension to the scenario planning process, and I think it's very imaginative to see what's been done here.
And just to piggyback on that, the other thing about the community involvement in verifying some of this as well can also add some agency and ownership on communities in participating in this work as well. So which can actually further bolster the validity of the results of these models.
But my big question is, can anybody run this anywhere? These are some fairly sophisticated tools with a lot of data demand. So what's the answer to that?
As for now, I think we will be the one running it, and we will need to spend a little bit more time and then get some resources as well to have it like as a real software. And right now, like to run this optimization one, for example, you do need like a little bit of technical knowledge. It's publicly already available. I reposited it in like GitHub. So whoever is, confident enough around it, like please feel free to reach out. I'm gonna show the paper and then also the GitHub repository as well. But RoofNet, for example, it's a data set. So we already have it available. So people can just download CSV file and then you're good to go. And GISSR, that's also ongoing. We are trying to make it more approachable. Right now we can run it, but you need a little bit of technical aspects on running it. But I'm very much excited. I've been working very closely with New York City agencies for past 7 years around all these tools, but it will be exciting to see like how it could be scalable in other regions too.
Can people reach out to you if they
Yeah,
Absolutely.
have it? Okay.
yeah, just to confirm, Dr. Miura and Law, people can reach out to collaborate with you and maybe have different scenarios in different locations throughout the country, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. No, do you want to put back the email?
Christine, you said you had a follow-up?
Yeah, and it partially got answered, but really that was it. It's can we specify by region, knowing that you you throw a million scenarios into the system and have all of these data sets. I guess my question is, as our climate continues to shift rapidly, how are we taking that into account with the data sets? Like, are we updating these data sets as we're seeing, day by day, how our climate impacts are changing, which then obviously means that flood risk changes?
Exactly. There are a lot of uncertainties involved with this one. People might move because of climate change, and then also the weather itself is going to change. So we are tackling one by one. No, she didn't mention this one, but she's also working on, maybe I can let her speak, but she's also working on some unbiased future weather scenarios that basically is not relying on only historical events, which a lot of people are currently doing, so that it's going to be unbiased from all these things happened already. That's going to be more, adaptable to those shifting climate. And no, do you want to give like a very short summary of this?
So we really want to make sure that models in the future, as we look at storm surge or hurricane storm events, aren't biased on this historical data. And so we're looking at using generative AI and physics informed rules to better be able to predict with lower variance and not, while being trained on historical data, still be able to provide kind of this more concise prediction space, because we don't want too conservative of an estimate, because the problem with too conservative of an estimate is when we have this warning, people don't move or they don't respond accordingly. And so we really want to minimize the uncertainty associated with these predictions. So I'm coupling generative AI, specifically using a diffusion model and sea level rise to steer each storm scenario generation. And then for both RoofNet and the flood visualization tool, RoofNet extensions are going to be looking at more of a dynamic resampling. So we did global, so we don't focus on heavy disaster prone regions right now. But in the future, there's ways to leverage things like satellite data to understand greenery of an area, so that maybe you can dynamically resample more information around that. And that might give you more insight for things like fires and the risk of the community for a given fire. For the flood visualization tool itself, what we are working towards is having users be able to log in and upload their geotiffs or send us their geotiffs. So if they have a scenario that they've modeled, while the modeling itself can be intensive, they can go through and upload it and actually visualize it on their own end.
All right, it's 2:30. We gotta go. It's time. It's Friday afternoon. This was I enjoyed it a whole lot, and I have many follow-up questions personally. So this was a wonderful conversation. You all are doing phenomenal work, and I loved hearing all about these different tools. Remember, everyone, if you need your AICP credits, don't forget to log your credits, and you can register for upcoming sessions and get on our once a month newsletter email at ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. And that's it.
We're doing
Everyone,
it again
hey.
next Friday with
Yes.
another
Oh,
colleague.
I'm sorry. You're right. You're right. We do. We have another one next Friday. So go ahead and register for that. That's going to be another great conversation.
And if you'd like
So,
to know more about the work being done by CUSP and colleagues like these, feel free to reach out to us, because we have a lot more folks who deal with fire as well.
Thank you, Ohio APA and Christine.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Everyone,
you.
hey, have a great weekend and we'll talk next time. Bye.